Okay, we're back with Thomas Taylor's dissertation on Aristotle's philosophy. We're dealing with the issue of the perpetuity or eternity of the world. And this last argument that Aristotle was looking at was for the necessity that the first type of motion be natural rather than violent, and so it can't be forced from without. Any comments that the Atlas myth was wrongly devised because of that. We shouldn't have the impression that there's effort constantly being put into keeping the universe in motion. So we'll back up a little bit in Aristotle, and then there's a long footnote, hopefully summarizing this section. Start right here. For everything of this kind is laborious, by how much the more it is perpetual, and destitute of the most excellent disposition. Hence neither must it be admitted that it subsists conformably to the ancient fable which asserts that its safety requires the aid of a certain Atlas. For those who composed this fable seem to have had the same conceptions as posterior philosophers. So once again, Aristotle seems to approve of the most ancient philosophers, just like Simplicius, and everybody else, basically. The ancients are always the best. For as if all the bodies on high had gravity and an earthly nature, they fabulously introduce an animated necessity as the support of the heaven. Neither, however, after this manner, nor through obtaining a circumgyration more rapid than the motion of its proper tendency, according to the assertion of Empedocles, must it be supposed that it has been preserved for such a length of time. Nor is it reasonable to think that it remains perpetual through the compulsion of soul, for it is not possible that such a life of soul can be free from pain and blessed. So we don't want the universe to be animated through the activity of a soul perpetually, because that seems laborious for the soul. And such a thing should be a divine soul, but the life of a divine soul should be free from toil. It is also necessary that the motion which subsists with violence, if it moves the first body, which is naturally adapted to be moved otherwise, and if it moves it continually, must be devoid of leisure. Right, because if the motion of the universe is its natural motion, then it won't require the effort of an outside agent. If it's a violent motion, then it's against its natural tendency, and that would require effort. So, and if it moves it continually, must be devoid of leisure and removed from all intellectual facility of energy. Because if it's always working to keep the universe in motion, then it doesn't have time for like philosophy or something. If unlike the soul of mortal animals, it is without that remission of the body which takes place in sleep, but the fate of some ixion must necessarily detain it perpetual and unwearied. If, therefore, as we have said, the first lation can subsist in the manner already mentioned, it is not only more becoming thus to conceive concerning its perpetuity, but in this way only can we unfold assertions confessedly concordant with our prophetic conceptions about the gods. But let thus much suffice at present for things of this kind. Okay, now a long footnote. This is probably mostly Simplicius. After concluding what has been demonstrated in the first book, that the heaven is ingenerable and incorruptible, and superior to all mortal difficulty, Aristotle now shows that its motion in a circle and permanency in it is without labor, natural, and not violent. But so just up front, I think the best argument there is like, if the first motion is violent, then what is the natural motion of it? Like, violent motion is kind of defined against natural motion, so the basic tendency of the first moving thing ought to be its natural tendency, so it shouldn't require difficulty from without. It should be natural to it. So there is a good argument in there, alongside maybe some more sophistical ones. But he very properly adds the violent to necessity, because not everything which is necessary is violent. For eternal natures subsist indeed from necessity, but not by violence. He shows, however, that the motion of the heaven in a circle is without labor and natural as follows. The heaven is indigent of no violent necessity. Which may prevent it from being moved in a different manner, like bodies which have a tendency downward, but which are made to be moved in a circle. That which is in want of no violent necessity to its motion has this motion unattended with labor. The heaven, therefore, is moved with the motion in a circle without labor and according to nature, and that a thing which is not in want of such a necessity is moved without labor, he shows from that being laborious and destitute of the most excellent disposition, which is indigent of violent necessity. For the best disposition, I feel like he was using, Taylor with his translation was using double negatives up there that shouldn't have been there. The heaven is indigent of no violent necessity, which would imply that it's full of violent necessity. If it's lacking no violent necessity, then he's saying the opposite thing of what Aristotle's sense was. But for the best disposition exists not according to violent necessity, but according to natural perfection. Not only, however, the violent is laborious, but also the laborious is violent. Okay, so they mutually entail. That's interesting. That violent motion would be laborious is clear, but that all laborious motion is violent, I guess, also follows. If, therefore, the laborious is violent, that which is not indigent of violent necessity will be without labor. There, too, he should drop the not. I don't know why he's putting these double negatives that change the meaning, but okay. But that the heaven does not require violent necessity is evident from this, that being divine, it has the most excellent disposition, and that which has the most excellent disposition does not require violent necessity, since those natures which do require it are destitute of the best disposition. This also is evident from nothing accurate being asserted by those who, instead of a cause, introduce a certain necessity of such a motion and permanency to the heaven. For some assign a fabulous necessity as the reason of the heaven not falling, but permanently revolving on high, as Homer says of Atlas. Atlas by strong necessity sustains heaven's ever-rolling, wide-extended plains, and the long pillars which on earth he rears end in the starry vault and prop the spheres. It's a nice translation by Taylor. Footnote by Taylor. The two last of these lines are to be found in the first book of the Odyssey, but I know not where the other two, which in their present state in Simplicius do not make a verse, are to be found. Going back to probably Simplicius. But others introduce a physical necessity instead of a cause why the heaven does not tend downward, viz. Its circulation being stronger than its proper tendency, as Empedocles and Anaxagoras say. So that kind of sounds like the idea of orbital velocity. You know, its proper tendency would be down, but it's moving fast enough in a circle that it avoids it. I wonder if there's any further elaboration. We don't have many fragments of Empedocles, and I don't know if we have anything of Anaxagoras, but I wonder if it's otherwise attested, this view of theirs, that sounds like the theory of like why orbiting bodies don't fall. Interesting. Others, again, introduce a psychical necessity, or a necessity arising from soul, the soul of the heaven urging it to remain perpetually moved with this motion, as Plato appears to say when in the Timaeus he asserts of this soul, quote, that circularly unfolding itself from the middle as far as to the extreme heaven, it began an unceasing and prudent life through the whole of time. Simplicius adds that if what is said of Atlas indeed is a human fiction devised from a suspicion that the heavenly bodies have gravity, it is justly confuted by Aristotle, because they have neither gravity nor levity. But if it is a fable concealing something divine and wise in itself, it must be said that Atlas is one of those Tartarian gods who are about Dionysus. Bacchus, Roman name. So Taylor's footnote, Bacchus is the deity of the intellect and soul of the world. So we saw before the soul of the world was identified by Plotinus with Aphrodite, and by Proclus with Aphrodite and Athena in different senses. Athena was more the intellectual aspect. Aphrodite was more like the total soul of the world. But here, maybe we have a distinction being the intellect and soul of the world, or maybe a female goddess necessarily has a correlative male god performing the same sort of function. Not really sure. It seems like a redundancy, but also the distinction could be intellect and soul. God of intellect and soul, rather than either the god of the intellect of the world soul, like Proclus treats Athena, or the god of the soul of the world, like Plotinus treats Aphrodite. So maybe the combination of the two or something. But anyway, so Simplicius here is interpreting the Atlas myth in a way that is true and favorable. Typically, Simplicius wants to harmonize the Hellenic tradition in general. We've speculated before that may be politically motivated. He's facing opposition from a hostile religious faction, Christianity. He was among the philosophers that were expelled from Athens in 529 AD by the Christians. So he wants to reconcile all the Hellenic sources. So here's his interpretation. So perhaps Atlas is one of those Tartarian gods who are about Dionysus, who, because they do not perfectly attend to him, i.e., do not energize according to Tartarian separation alone about the Dionysiacal energy, but in a certain respect also incline to the Jovian connection, energize according to both these characteristics. Okay. Footnote, Jupiter as being the source of life intellectually is peculiarly the source of connection to things. Okay. So Dionysus then, so the idea is Atlas being a Tartarian god about Dionysus, he partly energizes according to the appropriate Tartarian energy, which is a separative function, but then also inclines towards the Jovian energy, which is more integrative and essence bestowing. Not sure what that means yet. Atlas, therefore, being one of these titans, energizes according to both these about the greatest parts of the world, separating, indeed, the heaven from the earth and sustaining it, so that the natures above may not be confounded with those beneath. Okay, but why is Atlas... because he's one of the titans. But not all the titans are condemned to Tartarus. Is Atlas ever condemned to Tartarus?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I don't think so. But yeah. But his brother titans were. So, okay. Alright, so the sense in which he separates heaven from earth is in accordance with that Tartarian, titanic, divine energy, which goes along with Dionysus as a multiplying, processing kind of God, like a movement away from the abiding is related to separation. So plurality, which is Dionysiacal, is also separating. Okay, so he separates, but having separated, he again endeavors to connect the heaven and the earth with each other. For pillars possess both these powers, viz., a power of separating and a power of connecting things placed above with those placed below. But neither is the motion of the heaven nor the permanency of the earth in the middle occasioned by the rapid circulation of the ethereal body. Okay, so he's moving on from the Atlas thing. I guess the point being, Atlas wouldn't perpetually work against the natural motion of the heaven, but instead separates and unites it in a way that's balanced. And you could just take a typical kind of Proclean move and say that it affects these energies without labor, of course, through a kind of emanation where it causes without being affected itself. But neither is the motion of the heaven nor the permanency of the earth in the middle occasioned by the rapid circulation of the ethereal body, the lation according to its own proper tendency, which has gravity being diminished, as Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus appear to say. For though the ethereal body had gravity, yet the circulation being more rapid and stronger than its tendency downwards, both the earth and the heaven would remain in their proper places, the former being established in the middle, and the latter being moved in a circle, just as they say the water in a bowl does not run out when the bowl is whirled round, if the circulation is more rapid than the tendency of the water downward. Okay, so they reference, something like a centrifugal tendency accounting for the suspension of the heavenly bodies. It's their velocity, momentum, which for some of the heavenly bodies is certainly true. I guess relative to our vantage point, it's only true of the moon, but yeah. Aristotle, therefore, says it is improbable that the heaven and the earth should have been so long preserved in the same condition, if this condition was contrary to nature. For it is reasonable to suppose that the violent counteraction of the tendency downward might continue for a little time, but it is impossible that it should continue forever. Of course, that's bad reasoning, because the moon, according to modern science, has been orbiting for, 4 billion years? And it's contrary to nature in a sense. If this, therefore, be true, as it most undoubtedly is, the doctrine of centripetal and centrifugal forces must no longer be admitted in the explaining of the motion of the planets. Okay. Hence, neither could the heavenly bodies be thus perpetually moved if, having gravity, they are naturally adapted to tend downward. In the third place, it is absurd to say that a divine body remains perpetually moved in consequence of being compelled by its own proper soul, or that the motion in it, being compelled by soul, can remain perpetual. For that which is affected by violent necessity cannot be perpetual, since this is contrary to nature, and that which is contrary to nature, being a falling... I'm sorry, I'm kind of spacing out and not paying attention, so for my own sake, I'm going to back up a little bit. That's my bad. In the third place, it is absurd to say that a divine body remains perpetually moved, in consequence of being compelled by its own proper soul, or that the motion in it being compelled by soul can remain perpetual. For that which is affected by violent necessity cannot be perpetual, since this is contrary to nature, and that which is contrary to nature, being a falling off from that which is according to nature, cannot continue forever. Because the violent motion is defined on the natural motion, so you can't have something only ever move by violence, because the violent motion of a thing is defined against the natural motion. And being contraries, they have to proceed from one to the other, natural to violent and vice versa. Although, I guess some things can only ever move according to natural motion. So, like, that would be similar to Aristotle's observation, which he makes in De Anima and maybe elsewhere, that for every pair of opposites, one measures the other, one is independent of the other. So you can have a straight line without a curved line. You can define a straight line according to itself, but you can't define a curved line according to itself. It depends on the straight line to measure it. And so violent and natural motion is like that. Violent motion depends on natural motion to measure it. Natural motion does not depend, vice versa, on violence. So that's the distinction there. For it is also necessary that there should be that which is according to nature, and it is impossible that both should subsist at one and the same time. In the fourth place, he shows the impossibility of this from the moving soul, that neither after this manner is it possible that such a life should be without pain and blessed, but that it must be devoid of leisure and removed from all intellectual facility of energy, if the first body, being naturally adapted to be moved differently, for instance to the middle, its moving soul violently compels it to be moved in a circle. For not only that which is moved labors from a motion which is contrary to nature and violent, but also that which moves it, and especially if it moves continually and perpetually. For though it is difficult indeed, yet for once it may be borne through the remission of that which presses, but continually, so if it's difficult, it's still possible, but continually and perpetually, it is intolerable. And so he references Ixion, could have mentioned Sisyphus, although Sisyphus is not perpetual. He like labors, gets a little break, labors, gets a little break. Such a life also is worse than that of the souls in mortal animals, since they indeed, though their proper bodies are naturally adapted to be moved differently, according to the predominating tendency of the elements in them, and are therefore violently moved by their souls, yet they rest from this energy in sleep and in other animal relaxations. Yeah, Aristotle did mention that briefly, that it's without rest, without sleep, I guess to account for this possible argument that, well, the way that animal bodies are moved is violently by their souls. The natural tendency of these bodies is always disrupted by the activity of soul, and the activity of soul is always laborious in that case, so why couldn't you have the same for the heavenly bodies? Well, because the heavenly souls then would have an inferior and more laborious life than earthly souls, which would be inappropriate. But the souls of the celestial bodies, and which on this account are divine, will never have any rest from the motion contrary to nature. With respect to the fable of Ixion, it is as follows. Ixion, being present at the marriage of Juno, a cloud in the shape of that goddess drew near to him, and he, having connection with the cloud, a centaur was produced. But Jupiter, knowing the affair, bound Ixion to a wheel so that he might be incessantly rolled on it. The fable perhaps signifies that Ixion presided over a certain political and royal providence, but this form of life is heroical. Appearing, however, according to the similitude of Juno to be unworthy of such a life, he fell into the embraces of a certain material and obscure image of such a dominion, which the cloud signifies, it being obscure and more material air. Mingling with this cloud, he begot a centaur, which signifies that his energies were in the confines of the political and intellectual life. Because that's what the labyrinth, I guess, represents, and that's where Oh, wait, no, that's the Minotaur, not the Centaur. So I'm not sure why the Centaur signifies the confines of political and intellectual life. I guess yeah, it's not clear. Maybe the horse symbolizes the political because equestrian aristocracies formed the initial upper class and
Uh,
ruling
the,
class.
the only thing I could think of is Heracles' mentor was a centaur, I believe. I don't exactly know why, but
Okay.
maybe there's some precedent for it.
Yeah. Yep. Um, in any case, it's a mixed creature, human and animal, and so he's like bound up between the human and the animal, I guess. But he was bound by Jupiter, the demiurge, who distributes to everything according to its desert, to the wheel of fate and generation, from which, according to Orpheus, it is impossible for him to be liberated who is not commiserated by the gods, or by those gods, whom Jupiter appointed to diversify and roll human souls in the circle of malignity. I'm going to go ahead and kind of move past the Ixion interpretation. I'm not sure how critical it is to the argument. It now remains to inquire with what motion nature moves a celestial body, and with what motion soul moves it. Nature, then, is not of itself sufficient to move a perfect and essentially natural local motion. For neither is the motion of the four elements according to the tendency to the whole perfect and self-motive as being inherent in the mover, but rather resembles that which is casual and which is effected in a certain period according to that power of wholeness which is implanted in a part. So the action of nature is from the causally effective wholes which are in parts, not the whole which is prior to parts, which is more like the way that soul acts. For they have not in themselves, as being natural only, that which properly moves, since nature moves not being self-motive, but moved by something else, in consequence of not being more motive than moved. It may be said, therefore, that parts depend on the whole. So I guess implicit there is a kind of spectrum. You have something which neither moves nor is moved, and then you have something that is not moved but which moves, and then you have something which moves and is moved but is more a mover than a being moved, and then you have that which moves and is moved, nature. So the classes would be like the exempt one, uh, the first mover, um, and then soul, which is more self-motive than moved by another, and then nature, which is more moved by another than it is self-motive, and then lastly you would have body, which is moved only by another. Okay. So let's read that sentence again. For they have not in themselves, as being natural only, that which properly moves, since nature moves not being self-motive, but moved by something else, in consequence of not being more motive than moved. Okay, Aristotle does treat nature as a principle of motion. There is one natural motion for each thing, and the nature of a thing is its principle of motion. But Simplicius here is saying nature moves not being self-motive, but moved by something else. Hopefully he elaborates that a little bit. It may be said, therefore, that parts depend on the whole and on the perfect animation in the whole, but are deprived of a perfect nature. Okay, so the motive principle of nature is like the parts of a whole, so it's necessarily partial and imperfect. They are said, however, to possess nature so far as they are again adapted when moved to be conjoined with the whole. but the natural and animated whole is properly moved through nature as a medium. For nature is a certain vital aptitude in a subject body, through which the body is adapted to be moved by soul, and which through itself as a medium introduces the motive power of soul into body. But it's not merely passive, because the natural bodies themselves move without the intervention of soul. And this indeed appears to be conformable to the doctrine of Aristotle, since he says that soul is the entelechia of a natural body, the actualization of the potential. In what follows also, he says, we do not see in anything else whence the principle of motion is derived. And again, we have before shown that such powers are inherent in things which have the principle of motion. But he clearly says that things which have soul have the principle of motion, and not natural things, according to the interpretation of Alexander. Prior to Aristotle, also, Plato was of the same opinion. Just give me a couple seconds here. Okay, so Plato was of the same opinion. For in the 10th book of the Laws, he says that the motion which is moved by something else and which moves other things is nature. So it's both moved by another and motive of others, subsisting according to the aptitude to be moved, and not according to the aptitude of being motive. Hence, if it should be asked with what local motion nature and with what local motion soul moves the heaven, we reply that soul through nature as a medium causes the heaven to be moved in a circle, the motion being one and the same. But the heaven is moved by nature indeed, possessing a self-natural and not violent motion, and an aptitude according to it to be moved. And it is moved by soul according to a transitive energy to which it is naturally adapted, just as it is circularly moved by intellect according to an invariable sameness of subsistence. For through soul and intellect, which impart the vital motion inherent through nature in the body, it is perfected and restored to the similitude of intellectual energy. Hence also the divine Plato, investigating why the heaven is moved in a circle, says that it is because it imitates intellect. But Aristotle, having shown that it is not possible the motion of the heaven can be violent according to any of the above-mentioned modes, but that it is necessarily natural, if it is perpetual, adds that these things accord with our prophetic conceptions about the gods, viz., that it is requisite it should be without labor, and remain in perpetual vigor and blessedness. For thus alone can we unfold incontrovertibly concordant assertions, if we say that it energizes not violently, but conformably to its nature. But he calls this our common conception about the freedom from labor and blessedness of a divine nature prophetic, because being better than demonstrative evidence, it is most firm and irreprehensible. For such is prophetic information, proceeding into the soul according to divine inspiration in a manner superior to all demonstration, in conjunction with genuine faith. So interesting statements there. Similar to what's said in the Phaedrus regarding, and the commentary of Hermias on the Phaedrus regarding inspired states and how reliable things can be from them. But I'm actually going to end a few minutes early. We'll just start this chapter next time, and it's going to be a little while until we pick back up the next 2 weekends. So there will be no groups. So basically the beginning of September, we'll come back to this. But what is it going to be? Let's see. Let us now direct our attention to what Aristotle says concerning the tendency of bodies upward and downward as the causes of their gravity and levity. Okay, so we're going to deal with gravity and levity in more detail. That'll be cool. Any thoughts on the reading today?
No, sir.
All right.
I mean, I've only been in the groups for a couple weeks now, and I'm starting to see what you were saying about Aristotle before. Although it is interesting some of the things he says, because it always looks like he's working from a kernel of truth, or he's like referring back towards a different, like an older source of legitimacy. But I mean, a lot of what seems to be original to him, I'm not entirely following, and I'm not
Yeah.
super convinced I'm missing something.
Where he departs from Plato is generally where he's wrong, in my opinion, as well. But I like Simplicius trying to harmonize it and say how secretly, they are teaching the same doctrine. But we will come back to this before too long.